started. Welcome more folks as they come in. Thanks so much for joining us in part 2 of a 2-part training series on serving survivors. Part 2 will focus on confidentiality and safety in coordinated entry. If you joined us in part 1, welcome back. If you missed part 1, that recording is available on our YouTube channel. Craig shared the link in our chat, but we will share it again a little bit later in the presentation if you'd like to take a look at that training. My name is Hope Rogers. My pronouns are she, hers, and I'm the CoC Performance Manager with Texas Homeless Network. I'm very excited to be offering these trainings in partnership with Texas Council on Family Violence, who is sharing their knowledge and expertise with us on serving some survivors of family violence. A couple of quick housekeeping items. Today's session is being recorded, and the recording of the session will be available on our YouTube channel shortly after today's session if you'd like to revisit that or share it with your colleagues. There will be a copy of the presentation shared in the chat. We will share it a couple times for folks who join in later if you'd like to follow along with us and download those materials. And I think now I have the pleasure of introducing our trainers. If you joined us in part 2, these faces should be familiar to you. Please join me in welcoming Brielle Backus. I think I got that right, with the Texas Council on Family Violence, as well as Molly Thibodeau with Texas Council on Family Violence. So I will pass it over to them.
Thank you so much, Hope. Glad to be back. Glad to be here with all of you. Thank you for coming to part 2 of our training on serving survivors. As Hope said, my name is Brielle Backus. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a policy coordinator here at TCFV, and I'll let my colleague Molly introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Welcome back and welcome for the first time. Molly Thibodeau. I work with Brielle on the program policy sub-team over at Texas Council on Family Violence, and we're happy to be here for part 2.
Yeah. And we would love for y'all to share your name and program, where you're coming from, in the chat so we can see who's joining us today. I am going to just give a quick overview of what we're going to be covering for the next hour and a half. So first, we're going to do a quick recap of part 1. We know not everyone might have been able to join us for that, and so we wanted to just do a couple slides on that. Then we'll cover privacy obligations of family violence programs, as you might call them, victim service providers. And then talk about coordinated entry for survivors and putting that all into practice. I just want to say, please share in the chat your experiences, add whatever you'd like to the conversation. I don't believe anyone is an expert in anything, and I'm definitely not an expert in coordinated entry. So I have added what I know about privacy and serving survivors in this process, but would love to hear what y'all are doing in your communities as well, so we can all learn from each other. And with that, I'm going to throw it over to give to start the recap, give it to Molly Thibodeau.
All right. Yeah. And then thanks for saying that, Brielle. Like, you know, we're all here to learn from each other, and we have our perspective, and we want to learn from you and hear from you too in the chat. So we'll be monitoring that throughout. So we wanted to give just a quick recap, as Brielle mentioned. You know, in part 1, we really gave a basic overview around intimate partner violence, which we sometimes call family violence or domestic violence. You know, it can have a lot of different terms that we could use. And so the definition that we look to is around, you know, an ongoing pattern of power and control exerted by one partner over another in a romantic relationship, enforced by the use of abusive tactics. And so, you know, it's really rooted in that power and control, and those abusive tactics that reinforce that power and control. And, you know, in Texas, we also talked about the prevalence. 1 in 3 Texans experience intimate partner violence in their lifetime, including 204 Texans killed by their intimate partners in 2021. And what we also discussed what it can look like. What are the dynamics of intimate partner violence? Again, rooted in power and control. And we reviewed what many people are familiar with, the power and control wheel, which displays the different abusive tactics that are used. It doesn't necessarily describe or show all types of abusive behaviors or what one relationship might look like versus another, but it's a starting point to begin to understand those dynamics. And we also looked at the equality wheel that demonstrates, what a healthy relationship can look like. I always think that's important to put those two together. And in addition, we discussed the effects of trauma, the key components of trauma-informed care, the intersection of housing, homelessness, and intimate partner violence, where over 80% of US mothers with children experiencing homelessness have previously experienced domestic violence. And with survivors that were surveyed nationally, 64% of unmet requests of survivors were related to housing and emergency shelter. So the housing work is really important to us. And lastly, we offered best practices when a survivor discloses and offered tips and information about how to connect with local family violence programs in your community. And if you'll go to the next slide, Brielle, I just want to reiterate from last time. We talked a little bit about the family violence approach and framework, about what a survivor might expect when they go to a family violence program. And, we approach that with the survivor as the expert, right? So it's survivor-centered, survivor-led, and survivor-guided. And it's also trauma-informed. So we're thinking about someone's whole lived experience and taking into account the trauma that they might have experienced throughout their lifetime and directly related to the abuse. And all of our services are voluntary. So there's no requirement to do this, to get that. Everything is completely up to the survivor to decide. And which Brielle talked a little bit about last time, and we'll really get in deep this time around, confidentiality is required and protected by law. And so Brielle will talk more about that. And the next slide, I just wanted to remind y'all, TCFV has a service directory of family violence programs. You can click on that link there, and within the PowerPoint, and that'll take you to our service directory, and it's listed by city and can show you the counties that are served. And if any resource that you ever give to someone, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is an amazing resource where you can call, text, or chat with an advocate 24/7, 365. Hundreds of languages. They can help with safety planning, crisis intervention, and direct connection to local resources. So just wanted to remind you of what we talked about last time, or show you what we talked about last time if you weren't able to join us. But with that, I'll hand it over to Brielle.
Thank you so much for that recap. So with that, I'm going to jump right into the first part of today's training, which is to talk about an overview of the privacy obligations of family violence programs. We know that privacy, confidentiality, and privilege are words that are used by us all in different ways, and that a lot of times the laws around family violence programs and their confidentiality obligations are, talked about as something that's very important. But I think it's, as a policy nerd, it's helpful to look at what that actually says, what the statutes actually say, so you can get an understanding of what's required of them. But first, I want to talk just about those three words and how sometimes we use them interchangeably, but really they all have a little bit of a different meaning, right? So privacy is defined as a personal choice whether to disclose information. So we all have a right to privacy, to decide what we want to share in a moment with others in the space. It's kind of an umbrella term that we use a lot to cover these other pieces like confidentiality and privilege, but it's kind of the more general personal choice we all have around protecting our information or sharing our information. Confidentiality, as we're going to talk about it today, is an agreement and a grant-related responsibility to protect someone's information. So programs who receive grant funds are accepting those, knowing that they have to follow these obligations regarding confidentiality that we're going to talk about in detail in just a moment. And then privilege is a law or a statute prohibiting the disclosure of private information on someone's behalf. So programs, family violence programs, as well as sexual assault programs, not programs, I should say, domestic violence victims and sexual assault victims in the state of Texas have privilege when talking with advocates and programs. And so that is something that we have in Texas, which is amazing and hasn't always existed. But there is a privilege law in Texas that we'll talk about as well. So all three of these things are a little bit different, but very important and kind of work together to protect the privacy of survivors. So this is a list of all of the statutory frameworks that family violence programs are operating under. It's not exhaustive because we know even HUD has their own CFR regulations and other regulations by the Texas Homeless Network, or by the Balance of State, I should say, and their policies that we have to follow. But when we're talking about privacy and confidentiality, these are the statutes that most, if not all, family violence programs fall under. So FIPSA, the Family Violence Protection and Services Act, VOCA, the Victim of Crime Act, and VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act, all have mirroring language around confidentiality. So they have all actually worked together to have very similar, if not the same, language regarding confidentiality when receiving grant funds under those programs. Chapter 93 of the Texas Family Code is where you'll find the Family Violence Program Privilege Statute. Chapter 420 of the Government Court Code is where you'll find the Sexual Assault Privilege. And then Chapter 51 of the Texas Human Resources Code and Texas Administrative Code includes the regulations for programs that receive Health and Human Services Commission funds, which are FIPSA funds, actually just funneled down to Texas. But that's where you'll find the statute that they have to follow if they receive funds from HHSC. So lots to think about when talking about confidentiality and privilege. Looking at the actual language, so this comes from FIPSA that requires programs that take funds from FIPSA that confidentiality of records pertaining to any individual provided services must be strictly maintained, and that grantees and subgrantees shall not require a client to provide a consent to release his or her personally identifying information as a condition of services. So I wanted to include that piece specifically because it states that consent is not needed or cannot be required to receive services. So we cannot have them sign something that says, I consent to this, this, and this for you to be able to get shelter, right? So that is a condition of FIPSA. This is from VAWA, but again, language is mirrored in VOCA and FIPSA that says grantees shall not disclose, reveal, or release any personally identifying information of individuals collected in connection with services requested, utilized, or denied. So that means that even if a survivor calls the hotline and they do not receive services for some reason or another, we still cannot provide any information about that survivor, right? Even though they didn't come in for services, they didn't receive shelter, we still cannot provide information about them, regardless of whether the information has been encoded, encrypted, hashed, or otherwise protected. This, I think, is important when we think about HMIS, right? Because a lot of times nowadays data and information is passed around in very different ways, but this kind of says, like, no matter how you might receive the data, there is still no way to share that personally identifying information, even if there's these maybe protections in place around that data. And then programs are not allowed to disclose or reveal this client information without an informed, written, reasonably time-limited consent of the person, right? So when we talk about a release of information, there are very specific requirements around what that release has to look like to be able to provide information outside of the program, right? Yes. So what do I mean when I say personally identifying information? Again, this is in statute that personally identifying information is anything that's likely to disclose the location of a victim, including the name or address, the contact information, the social security number or date of birth. This is taken almost verbatim from the statute. So that's kind of the stuff we usually think about. But then it says any other information that would be combined and serve to identify an individual. This is really important because it can look very different depending on the community you're in, right? So if you're in a large metro area, a person with 4 children of a specific religious identity might, describe a lot of people. In a very small community, that might really describe one person in your community. So it's up to the program to protect that identifying information and to really think about what that means. That confidentiality requirement to make sure that information leaving their program is not identifying is really on the program to uphold. And that's why we can't always say, like, this data point is identifying, this data point is identifying, because it really depends on the community you serve, the people we're talking about, and the information that you're putting together in sequence. I'm talking very fast, so please, if there's any questions, put them in the chat. We will get to them. A lot of people then might ask, what can you share? There are definitely exceptions to what you can share as a family violence program receiving these funds. The one that might be most relevant is this. It says non-personally identifying information in the aggregate regarding the services and demographic non-personally identifying information in order to comply with data collection requirements. So this is what states that we can share information, but we have to make sure that it's not personally identifying and that it's in some type of aggregate form. There are obviously other exceptions, such as if there needs to be a mandatory report of abuse or neglect, and a few others that are in there. And then lastly, for this section, I want to talk about the privilege statute. So under Texas law, confidential and privileged communications for family violence victims is written or oral communication between an advocate and a victim made in the course of advising, advocating for, counseling, or assisting the victim, and it's confidential and may not be disclosed. There's quite a few other pieces in this statute, but I thought this was the most important. And the other piece is that to know that privilege is owned by the survivor. So while programs have to keep information confidential, the survivor is the one that gets to choose what information is shared outside of the program, right? So it is up to the survivor to say, if they're working with an advocate, I would like you to share this information with this person at this other program, right? Or this, my attorney, or this person working at the courts, whatever it might be, right? It is up to them, but they are the ones that have to make that decision and guide that conversation about what information is shared. Otherwise, it is confidential and can't be disclosed by the advocate. So I don't see, yes, Molly, we'll talk about ROIs down the line, but yes, it has to be very specific and time limited. I do have a slide specifically about that, of releases of information or ROIs. So why is this important? I think Molly and Jen talked about this a lot in part 1. But just to reiterate, abusers often use extraordinary measures to locate their victims, cut victims off from access to friends, family, resources, right? And with advances in technology, that only has increased the risk for victims with what information they might be sharing in other places that, you know, could be used against them by the abuser, right? So really, as I said in part one, privacy equals safety, right? Survivors often are every movement they have and their social interactions are controlled by the abuser. The resources they have are controlled by the abuser. And when they are fleeing or even with an abuser, right, regaining control of their lives, including control of their personal information, is important to moving forward and is important to taking power back in their lives and in their relationships. So that is why it is so important for the survivors to be able to choose what they share in moments, for them to be able to analyze the risk of where that information goes after they share. Thinking about HMIS, that is an information sharing system, right? And so it is very important to have those conversations with survivors about what that means, who can see that information, what the risks might be, because we don't know their story, we don't know their safety, we don't know who their abuser might be, right? And how they might be able to access certain information. And so we can't make those decisions for them if it's safe or not to share information wider than with just us. And is why it's so important for them to be able to have those conversations and make those choices, and for us not to make those choices for them. So just some basic fundamentals of confidentiality, you know, like what I just shared, fully informed consent allows that survivor to choose, and it cannot be presumed or required because someone uses your services, right? So we cannot say you must provide this information in order to receive a service. That at least family violence programs can't do that, and I think it's a good practice for everyone, right? The information is the survivors, and they should understand what's happening with it and who has access. And then for family violence programs, if they do get a release of information, it must be executed within the family violence program with the survivor. So sometimes they might, let's say, a program refers to the VSP or to the family violence program, and they get an ROI to do that. That doesn't cover it for information to be shared the other way around, right? It's not a two-way street. So it has to come from the family violence program, and the survivor working with them to allow that information to be released. All right, I'll pause for just a second, take a sip of my water before we move on to part two. Does anyone have any questions about part one? And if you chat them in at any time, we can always circle back. So let's talk about coordinated entry. Y'all probably know this. I'm probably preaching to the choir here. What is coordinated entry? But I wanted to cover all my bases, right? The goal of coordinated entry is to increase the efficiency of local crisis response systems by improving fairness and ease to access to resources, and is intended to help communities prioritize people who are most in need of assistance. Many times this includes the HMIS database having a by name list, which is used to allocate housing resources to households. I believe in the balance of state, you call it a housing priority list. So I might call it that, or the HPL moving forward when talking about that. All communities are struggling, right, with how to prioritize resources because we all don't have enough. Like, we are aware that housing is the #1 need in communities right now. We see that for survivors. We see that everywhere. It's a rough market out there. So we know that it's a struggle for all communities, and prioritizing those resources is a struggle, right? So I recognize that as I talk through all of this. but we're going to talk about some of the specific needs and issues relating to family violence programs participating in coordinated entry and survivors being serviced through coordinated entry, as we move forward. So because of all of the laws we just talked about, victim service providers are federally barred from entering into HMIS, requiring there to be a need to add survivors to the by name list or housing priority list in a de-identifying matter, which we often call the DV workaround. I know that Balance of State has worked with TCFV and others in the past to create a DV workaround because we know survivors who reach out to family violence programs are in need of this critical resource, right? It's a needed resource, and without being able to participate, it's a lot more difficult for survivors to get that resource, right? So according to the coordinated entry written standards, regions must designate an agency for entering that information into HMIS for VSPs. So there is a way for VSPs to offer de-identifying information to another agency that has access to HMIS and get them on the list. That is all in the written standards. We'll talk about some of the issues with that. We do know that, sometimes that's difficult to get survivors on the list. And then even when their name comes up, sometimes it's difficult to contact them or the agency to get them into the housing. But there is a process in place, and we'll talk about kind of ways to make that easier, right? I do want to point out that because of this this requirement to not enter into HMIS, that VSPs do have to have a, if they receive HUD funding, a comparable database. So that means a database that is able to enter all the information that is needed for HMIS just within their own database. We all know HUD's kind of confusing, right? They got a lot of rules and a lot of regulations. For VSPs, this can be a real struggle because they are dealing with less staff, maybe less education. They don't have an HMIS lead to support them in this, right? That maybe other communities might. And so I just want to point that out, that like there is a lot of, barriers and maybe kind of hurdles that VSPs are working through when they do receive HUD funding and work to participate in this, because it is a lot that they're taking on. It's a new funding source for a lot of programs. So there's there's a big learning curve there to participate, and they often don't have the capacity or the staff to do that because that's taking away time with working with survivors, right? And that's the same for all of y'all working with directly. So, but I just wanted to name it. And we do know with working with THN that currently only 3 VSPs in the Balance of State are actively participating in their communities by name list. So if that's not one of your communities, maybe think about why. Like, how can we talk about building that relationship and working with VSPs to be able to add survivors to that list? And Molly, I see some chat going through.
Okay. Well, I didn't know if you wanted to pause for chat or not, but I feel like we kind of had this conversation, maybe if I'm interpreting it correctly. But Craig asked, so does this get divided up into the different CoC jurisdictions? And he means kind of, the regional agencies that enter information into HMIS for VSPs. And he also says, I guess I'm taking it as the by name list is regionalized, but should a housing opportunity open in a different CoC, could that be a viable option?
Again, I'm not as familiar with maybe what that could look like. I do know that the HPL and Hope, or if you want to jump in, I know that the HPL is like based on region. So each region probably has a different agency that might be the one entering the data for their local VSPs. So I do believe the lists are by region. We've talked a little bit about like what it looks like, because a lot of times, you know, survivors might not want to stay in their region, right? If
I
they're
think that's kind of
fleeing.
what I was alluding to. If the
Yeah.
client wasn't safe in their community where their by name list is, and they have client
Mhm.
choice, or would they just have to
Absolutely.
get in line again at the other COC and hope their name comes up?
I think that's a great question, and I'm not sure I have a good answer, but I think it's something that we have to continue to think about, because I do know that happens quite a bit, that a survivor is just like, I have family in this other county. How can I get service over there? So I think there's always a need to like talk about, how do we create that warm referral? How can we refer over and connect them to someone else? And
Can you read
great.
that? Do you want
And
me to read?
Jordan shared, yes, the systems change team and the HMIS team at THN just started having discussions around transferring regions and creating a process for doing so. Yes, this did just come up in a meeting that I was able to sit in. So it's a timely question. And I think a great like point that y'all have noticed and are working on, and can really, I think, be yes, good time. Yeah, I think it's a good thing to have a process for that, because it will come up for quite a lot of survivors. Thank you for that. All right, so I just wanted to share this. Again, I'm a policy nerd, and so I'm like, show me the info in writing. So this is actually created by the National HUD, and it's what we call the comparable database decision tree. So it says, should the project enter data in HMIS or a comparable database? So if they're a victim service provider, automatically not allowed in HMIS. If they receive funds from FIPSA, VOCA, or VAWA, and they use them across their whole agency, again, not allowed to enter into HMIS. But I did want to point out this section right here around, do they receive it and support specific projects? Because I do think this can happen in quite a few programs, even if you're like mainly serving people experiencing homelessness, right? But you might receive a VOCA fund. And if you keep, and that might require some firewalling and some thinking about, okay, so this one project or these staff and this one shelter cannot enter into HMIS, but these others can, and that will take some work to build those safeguards to ensure that you're following confidentiality. So if you haven't seen this, it's a great resource and super helpful. If you're wondering, oh, I received this VOCA grant, what am I allowed to do, right? So let's talk about survivor participation in coordinated entry. I want to start by saying there is no simple solution to complex problems, right? We know that based on part one, that a lot of survivors experience homelessness, and a lot of people experiencing homelessness have also experienced trauma, right? So this is a complex group of people that need resources, and there is no simple solution to serving them. I can't take credit for that statement. It's in one of the, I think it's in the, I think it's on the next slide, or one of the resources. I took it from them. There is no simple solution to complex problems. So when we talk about survivor participation in coordinated entry, we have to look at kind of how we assess people and how we prioritize people on the HPL, right? Most communities choose the VI SPDAT, and that's, I know the Balance of State chooses that as well, as a way to assess need and prioritize those that are most in need based on that assessment, right? If we look at research around the VI SPDAT, it really it has been shown to better predict the vulnerabilities of white people experiencing homelessness. It does not often highly predict the vulnerabilities of women with children or the experience of people living in an abusive situation. That can look very different, and because of that, their scores may not accurately, they might not reflect their need within this assessment. also want to mention that it does really rely on kind of a checklist format of questions that are very sensitive and potentially re-traumatizing. And so without training around how to ask those questions in a trauma-informed way to create safe spaces and build trust for people to want to share that information or feel comfortable to share that information, you may not be getting the disclosures that are accurate or true, especially if we talk about people experiencing abuse. They might not feel safe sharing vulnerabilities for fear of them being used against them, especially if they have children, if we're talking about mental illness diagnosis. Other factors to think about that might not fit into this assessment of prioritization is a lot of people experiencing abuse might still live with their abuser or live with family or friends. If you ask a domestic violence survivor whether they would rather stay in an unsafe home so there's a roof over their children's head or live on the streets, like which one do you really think they're going to choose? They might not have any other option than to stay in that unsafe environment. And if they have another option, they would take it, right? But if we're looking at how the assessment or prioritization prioritizes chronically homeless, that's not going to show up in that definition of chronically homeless, right? The idea or other factors unique to survivors is that they may be experiencing ongoing harassment and have multiple moves needed. So maybe it is possible that you're able to help relocate them, and then the abuser finds them and it's an unsafe situation all over again. And then this series has to happen all over again, right? They might be lacking resources due to their abuse or due to housing discrimination or rental problems due to law enforcement being called over and over to their house, and then that leading to eviction, right? That might not show up in the assessment either. I'm trying to think if I had any other pieces to add to that. So just some things to think about, like the nuances of the abusive situation that might not show up in that assessment. And so without more nuanced factors, survivors are often not prioritized or receiving the high enough scores to move up on that list. I do know that the balance of state has other prioritization factors, right? I know that there's one question in the VI SPDAT around abuse, but some research, I believe in the limitations of the VI SPDAT for survivors document that I have linked on this slide, says that often that's not answered accurately or is written in a confusing way. So it might not get to that factor, right? Anything else you want to add, Molly T, to that?
Yeah, I just dropped a plug for our Creating Safer Spaces webpage survivor housing section, and you can find out more information about specific rights and options for survivors, specifically lease termination options for survivors. And so there's 2 webinars on there. So I just want to drop that. There's a lot of other great information we feel like on there too. So check it out.
Great. Thank you.
Yeah.
And so there has been some research, especially done by our Safe Housing Partnerships, which is a national organization of homelessness providers and victim service provider organizations, to look at other ways to think about prioritization. And there's no perfect way, right? No one has figured it out yet and is like, yeah, we got it. But I just wanted to include it as another thing to look at as another option, right? So this shows a process that's more based on matching and like a decision tree kind of format instead of a prioritization list, and really focuses on specifically safety concerns related to housing. So it's very, straightforward. Thinking about one of the first things that, especially working with survivors, it's always okay to ask, are you in immediate danger, right? Safety is always one of the first questions you want to assess for, especially immediate safety. And if they are not in immediate danger, and they get to define that, right? Thinking about other different ways of maybe working with them to assess their needs, understand barriers to housing or stable housing in a different way. So again, not perfect, not saying y'all should just like take this and run, but just another way of thinking about it. This is also from kind of that same research around alternative ways of thinking about coordinated entry systems to increase survivor access. And I just want to point out a few pieces on this list. Again, always assess for immediate danger, and also realize that or recognize that shelter, just because someone identifies as a survivor or experiencing domestic violence, shelter doesn't have to be the first option, right? And shouldn't always be the first option that we jump to. There's many reasons why a survivor might not want to go to shelter. They might not want to uproot their lives, right? Moving to the shelter means moving 40 miles away and uprooting their children and their lives, or not getting to work, right? Maybe they've already tried it, right? Maybe they've identified other ways of, keeping temporary housing, like staying with family or friends, or a hotel in the area might be a better choice, right? So just because they've experienced domestic violence might not mean that going to a DV shelter is the step that they're interested in. And if we think about moving forward and, addressing those barriers and staying safely housed, just thinking about where, as you're working with survivors, can you create that space for that conversation, and really harken back to part one, where we talk about recognizing the impact of trauma, what a trauma response might look like, and how can we build trauma-informed conversations that offer safety, that build trust, that are more of a collaboration. So this is just another, again, just a tool from one of those resources. I recommend you read the paper. It's really great. And it also, one of them offers kind of these exercises for how to build that empathy, how to talk about options, because we're also not asking you to like be an advocate and be a therapist, right? So like, it's okay to focus your conversations on housing, right? And also be empathetic in those conversations. So just it offers some resources in how you can do that. So you can offer empathy and listen actively, but then also try and redirect the conversation and negotiate options and offer them all of the options you might have in your community, and talk through those with the goal of, addressing the barriers to safe and stable housing and making that the ultimate goal. So again, those are all linked in the resources as well. All right, I'm almost on time. I'm very close. So let's talk about putting this into practice. So with these next few slides, I laid them out as if we're walking through the assessment process. So what are some tips or things to think about during the assessment, during case conferencing, and then like when connecting survivors to housing? Please utilize the chat if you would like to add to them. Again, I am not an expert in coordinated entry, and these are just what I've heard through research, through working with programs, working with the balance of state. So please share anything that you might want to. So if we're talking about the assessment piece, so actually working with the survivor, I want to start by saying only 10 to 25% of survivors reach out to a family violence program for services. So it's very likely that they might reach out to a homeless service program first, right? And that's okay, and it's going to happen, right? But knowing that, and knowing that many people who experience homelessness are also experience trauma, there's ways that y'all can build in that trauma-informed care and that building trust and creating a space where they feel safe and comfortable deciding what information to choose that they understand what that looks like when they share that information, where it's going, the point of it, right? So just a few tips. So again, assess for safety needs and safety planning, really making sure that they're not in immediate danger at first. Informed consent. So explain what the housing priority list is, explain what HMIS is, who can see it, what it means to be entered, how that might impact their safety plan. So again, we don't know their safety concerns. We don't know their abusers. We don't know their relationships, and we can't assume that it's okay. In any situation, especially in crisis, or, you know, to receive any service, there's so many times, right, that we'll sign whatever's put in front of us, right? So especially in this situation, if someone's like, oh, you're going to help me get housing, I'll sign whatever you put in front of me. I'll answer any question you ask me. Might be someone's answer, and we really need to recognize what we hold, even if we're trying to be as relational and equal as possible. Like, there's always going to be that power imbalance in our roles as helping providers, as service providers. And that's why informed consent is so important, for them to understand, you know, that they can opt out of sharing any information that they would like, that there are other options. If they do disclose that they're a survivor, that there is another place they can go that has higher confidentiality protections, right? If that is a concern. And if they say they don't want to, and they want to keep working through it with you, that's okay too, right? They get to choose. I also know, and I wanted to make sure it was on here, that refusal to answer or asking to be put on the list with those de-identified data points is still an option, whether you're at a VSP or not, correct? I believe. So even if they're like, I don't want to go to a family violence program, but I do prefer not to have all my information put into HMIS, and to use that de-identified option, like that should be an option as well, because that is what works best for the survivor. I think it's also, you know, how you ask the questions, right? Recognizing the sensitivity of the questions, and really thinking of how you can do that in a way, you know, we've all sat across from someone that, you know, rattles them off, right? Really, really quickly, and just is like, check, check, check. So building that space where it feels more like a conversation and they have the ability to think about it or share whatever they'd like, can be really helpful. Lastly, I want to mention, you know, maybe just also being creative in other ways around, you know, I talked to a program that was really creative in how what information they offered for, like, how do they want to be contacted afterwards, you know? So maybe they're working with the victim service provider, but they would prefer the homelessness program to call when their name comes up on the list. So really talking about any option about, like, when is it safe to contact you when your name comes up, right? Those kinds of questions to ask around safety and working with that person moving forward at assessment. And lastly, think about when you do the assessment, right? Is it the first time you're talking to them? I know sometimes it is just like, it could be they call a line and that is the point, is to do the assessment, but how can we build in some trauma-informed care when that happens? And it's not the first thing that happens, because again, thinking about the sensitivity of the questions and the information that they're sharing, that there might, I know that I was talking to, and maybe this goes more into when we're talking about being at a family violence program, but you know, that it shouldn't happen right at intake if possible, that there might be other needs that need to be addressed before that assessment happens, right? And that's okay. I kind of jumped all over the place on that slide, but hopefully it made sense. And then I wanted to I pulled this straight from the Coordinated Entry Written Standards, where it talks, it gives you kind of a prompt if you're like searching for the words. I know it's not always easy to talk about this topic. And then the importance of a warm referral, right? Oh, that's the one I forgot. So a person might say like, yes, I would like to be connected to a family violence program. It's okay to just give the number. It's even better to have a connection there already and make the call with them, right? Because we don't know if they leave, if that's, they're not actually going to make the call, or that they're going to call and maybe not be able to, explain how they got the referral. I know that happens to me a lot, where a survivor calls and said, oh, I got your number from this person. They said you could, help. But if you can actually build that relationship to make a warm referral at the time and connect them in real time, to make sure that they have that connection and next step, that can be super helpful. So again, as it says in the written standards, assessors can continue the CE process with the household if they would like to. But if they do decide they would like to move and do the assessment with the VSP, that's absolutely okay too. I apologize, 1 second, my cat is scraping my door up. I'm so sorry. Apologies. All right, so talking about the assessment done at the victim service provider, right? So a lot of the same things that I just said. Almost every bullet point on this slide is exactly the same. The two I want to talk about is really those confidentiality pieces that make a difference between being entered through a VSP and being entered through a mainstream coordinated entry point. So if the assessment happens through a victim service provider, there is certain information, right, that you'll provide to your other agency to enter into HMIS, but you want to make sure that's de-identified, right? I know the Balance of State has worked on this, and it's also up to the program to review that data and make sure that it's not identifying, right? Because it's going to change by community. And also the survivor should know what information is being passed on, right? And so making sure that they know what's being entered into HMIS and that they feel comfortable with it and they feel like it's not identifying, and that the program also feels like they're upholding their confidentiality obligations. And then once you've done the assessment, there is no need to keep the documentation of the assessment. You'll probably want to record the score, the client ID that you gave, or the de-identified number that you gave to the other agency to be entered into HMIS. That way, when their name comes up and you get the call, you can refer back and figure out who that client is. But there is no need to keep the VI SPDAT or the assessment page. I have confirmed that with THN, so I'm not just making that up, but it really is important, as a policy and kind of a best practice of family violence programs. I usually say keep as little information as possible for the shortest amount of time as possible, right? And so this would fall under that. This is not from THN, but just an example of what the DV workaround might look like on a housing priority list. It will look different for y'all, but I just wanted to show like how little information really needs to be shared and should be shared. I'm so sorry, excuse me. So the referral submission date, of course you'll need to know how many bedrooms are needed, the score of the assessment. I know that there are a few COVID prioritization questions that have been added, but again, want to make sure that it's about giving the bare minimum of the information needed and that it is de-identifying, but also the contact information, right? That's going to be huge. Make sure that you have a good contact for the program. A lot of people either put the advocate's name and phone number or email of the person that's working with the survivor. It could be the agency's hotline number so that if that advocate has left, there's turnover in everyone's jobs now, right? That you still can get in contact with that agency hotline. But yes, this is an example from a national kind of white paper That's also really great around CE, but just showing the limited amount of information that should be included in a DV workaround. All right, so then the next step usually in communities is case conferencing, right? And I feel like this is where I've heard some confusion and concerns when it comes to confidentiality and privacy of survivors. In the written standards and in best practices, victim service providers can and should be part of case conferencing if they're contributing to the housing priority list. I have heard that, oh, how do you do that when they're not allowed to share any information, right? And guess what? It's possible, right? It might just take a little extra communication and planning ahead. So if in your community you see that a de-identified entry is coming up on the list or is one that you want to talk about in case conferencing, it would be best practice to reach out to that agency, to that family violence program and say, hey, this number, this de-identified number is one that we would like to talk about next week or whenever at the next meeting. And that advocate then can go to that survivor and ask like, hey, this is what case conferencing is. This is the benefits of, us sharing information. These are the risks. Do you have anything you would like me to share with them, right? About maybe your situation changing or safety concerns or whatever it might be. And then the survivor can choose yes or no, right? They can execute a release of information with their advocate to share that information of what they would like to bring forward. If they say no, that's okay too, right? I will be honest, I have never been a part of a case conferencing, but I have heard that they've, that sometimes that name will come up or that de-identified number will come up and they'll say, oh, well, we can't learn anything, so let's just move on, right? Or something like that. And I think just thinking about other ways that you might be able to assess based on the score, based on the information you do know, or victim service providers can be there as I wrote expert, but I said no one's really an expert, but they have knowledge around the dynamics of domestic violence, right? And safety planning that they might be able to share in a general sense. They could also take information back, right? If it's saying, hey, this person is working with your agency, they might not be able to like confirm or deny, right? But your agency's name is on there. They can sit and listen and take that information back and see what, possibly share that with survivors to move things forward, right? So just some ideas, like even though we have to uphold confidentiality, there are ways to still participate. Because I mentioned a release of information, I just wanted to give a brief overview of what that looks like and what is required. Again, this has to be executed at the family violence program. So the survivor working with their advocate to execute this. And really, I think of a release of information as a conversation tool. Because again, it's about that analysis of risk and benefits and understanding having informed consent from the survivor to take certain information forward. So what is required under law to be on a release of information is one name, so that's one survivor name, one agency that you can share the information with, that they're giving you permission to share the information with, a beginning and end date. That has to be time limited, so that cannot be for the duration that they're working with the program. It could be until the next case conferencing meeting, right? Or just for that week of the case conferencing meeting, but it cannot be a long span of time. Signatures by the survivor and the advocate, and the ability for the survivor to alter or revoke that release of information. Best practice says that it gives permission to share information with just one name, one individual. It gives you the means of communication. So is it to be shared in writing, over an email, over telephone, in that one meeting and nowhere else? And and then having that conversation. So that analysis of the risks and benefits. It is very specific, and also this is what protects survivors' privilege and confidentiality rights, because if we make it too broad, it can be argued that there is no, that there is no confidentiality protection there anymore. So it's very important that you have a properly executed release of information. And it's why program advocates cannot share more than what is in this document. So the next step, right? Oh, I meant to add a slide here. So let me just talk about that. So I know it's a very common phrase that everyone hears when we talk about privilege is, I cannot confirm or deny. I hate that phrase because that basically says that you do know the person possibly, or you know some information and you're not going to share it, right? Or it feels very blunt. It doesn't feel, great between anybody. The person that has to say it, I've had to say it. I don't like saying it. And it doesn't feel great for the person you're talking to. So I think a way to reframe it is, one, talk about that you're all working towards the same goal, right? We all have the same goal of getting survivors and getting people in housing, right? For them to be stably housed. And recognize that with everyone we're working with. It's one of the reasons I started this whole training with 30 minutes of the statutes, is for everyone to realize, like, we're not making this up. It is in law. And if we want to keep the funds that we get, we have to follow it, right? So building relationships and education around it before it comes up is really important. And then when it does come up, how do you have that conversation of, I can provide this general information about the survivor experience, right? I can take that back to my team and talk about it, right? Sometimes it's, I'll take that message and do what I can, I'll follow up if I can, right? And it's also the other programs recognizing, like, it's going to take some time, right? To maybe for them to go back to talk to the survivor if they are working with the survivor, right? But respecting that boundary is really helpful. So I hope that's helpful in kind of reframing that I cannot confirm and deny. And then what do you do when the de-identified entry is next on the HPL, right? So I already mentioned, hopefully there's already multiple forms of contact listed, so that you can easily reach out to the agency that put that name on the list. Hopefully beforehand, you've built that connection to know who you can contact. I've heard some programs say, they'll have one person's name, maybe it's the director of a program, but know that, like, when they call, someone that knows when they call what they're talking about, right? I've also heard, sometimes maybe a provider might call the hotline and the hotline worker has no idea what an HPL is or what coordinated entry is, right? So train everyone that might get that call to understand what that process looks like, and how to address it when it comes up, when they get that call, right? Be patient as the advocates work to reach out to the survivor and execute ROIs. They're not going to be able to answer or address it right away because we need the survivor to lead the process. So it will take time for that to happen. And then VSPs should work regularly or have a process to clean out the list of de-identified contacts. I have heard that from multiple communities also, that, a name will come up to the top and they'll say, oh, that person already has housing, or, that person doesn't, want to participate anymore, whatever it might be. And that happened like 2 weeks ago, a month ago, 6 months ago, right? And so to stay proactive and make sure that the list is up to date, because victim service providers don't have access to HMIS, there should be a process in place for them to do that, or to alert the other agency of what names to take off, or whatever that might look like, so that we can also do our part to keep that list clean. Anyone else have any other tips, advice, things that have worked really great in their community when it comes to this process of survivors participating in coordinated entry? Feel free to chat them in while I talk about my last slide. So other, big ideas around effective collaboration, because I really do think a lot of what I've said is that relationship building between family violence programs and the other homelessness service providers in the area. It's going to be about building that trust, building that relationship and connection, the mutual understanding of each other's roles, and having processes in place to execute anything that might come up in the moment, and really think about those beforehand, before you're in the moment of having to deal with it, right? Is how you're going to have a successful coordinated entry process that includes survivors. So creating mutually agreed upon goals and values that ensure equitable cross-system access for survivors. So again, just sitting, having those conversations, recognizing we all have the same goal of housing, of getting people into housing. Set aside funding specifically for families or survivors. I know that's kind of a big one and not always easy to do, but is really helpful, I think, to think about how can we have, if survivors are not being prioritized in the list itself, what are other ways that we can help them gain access, right? I think another great example of that in creating low barrier access for survivors is the emergency housing vouchers. I know that THN did an amazing job of making that a very low barrier process to receive those vouchers. And because of that, we know that half of them went to survivors. And that wasn't because it was only VSPs referring, right? That was self-referrals, that was, that was some advertising, but like just an amazing accomplishment. Yes, Jim, woo, woo, like for it, and shows you that like with those low barriers to access, like survivors in need were served in a way that I've never seen in my 4 years here. So that was awesome. Provide cross-training on relevant topics. So just as, I said that victim service providers might not be as familiar with the ways of HUD or housing service providers. And maybe homelessness programs might not have all the training around trauma-informed care or the dynamics of domestic violence. How can you help each other out with those, right? Hold regular meetings between the leadership of VSPs and housing service providers. So how can you come together regularly to talk about issues? And then this is one that I have heard work that in some places, maybe it won't in others, but just because victim service providers can't enter into HMIS doesn't mean they couldn't view parts of it. So in that way that, I've heard of a community that has view only access to HMIS, and it really helps them if a survivor is like, I want to get on that list, how do I do it? And they're able to search and actually see the survivor's already on it, right? Or something like that. Or it's a way for them to be able to see what de-identified entries do I need to clean out. So just a few ideas. Let me read Hope's comment. I'm curious what advice you would give to a mainstream housing provider to better engage their local VSP in case conferencing. Yeah. Which can make it difficult to continue building a working relationship. Yeah, I think that's a good question. And I would love to hear if there's any victim service providers here that do participate in their case conferencing. What has worked for you? Again, I think the idea of, of course, it's hard to have a conversation if you don't know that name is coming up on the list. So I think the idea of maybe planning ahead could be really helpful. and building those relationships in advance and knowing who to contact, right? So you know someone that understands what case conferencing is, what happens at the table, what the goal of it is, and that someone at the VSP understands that and is able to be at the table and like provide some kind of information would be helpful, because I'm not sure, you know, if those conversations are happening beforehand. Any other thoughts, Molly?
Well, I put in the chat earlier, you know, if you're having trouble connecting to or need help in identifying local programs in your service area, you know, I listed the service directory, but you're welcome to reach out to us as well. We might know somebody personally, right, that we could reach out to and make a warm referral. Practice what we're preaching there, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of my main advice there, is those relationships in advance. Yeah.
And I also know, you know, we've looked and seen that 3 VSPs are actively participating, you know, so maybe it's not just case conferencing, but we have to start farther back at A, right? Of like, even just for VSPs to understand what is the COC, what do they do, how can they participate, right? Because I know I've talked to a lot of programs that are maybe rural or smaller, or you know, again, just don't have the capacity or the staff to really dig into it. I know a lot of them will, I've heard from a couple that like open the application or the NOFO and are like, no, thank you, goodbye, right? And so I think there is a lot of education that can be done to just build those relationships before we talk about case conferencing, right? I started with this slide in part 1. I'm going to end with it. I think Molly and I have said it enough, but really I don't think you can do anything without building a strong relationship. And that means VSPs reaching out to their partners in the community and vice versa. So these are all the resources. I saw Molly dropping a lot of them in the chat, but here's everything that I referenced in the presentation. And also Molly, I know in part 1 had a bunch of great resources as well. I can't leave without mentioning our Purple Postcard campaign. If Molly, you want to drop that in the chat, that would be great. So we know that housing is a critical need in our state. And this is our campaign that is our way of telling the legislature that people support funding for survivors. So it's really easy. You just sign your electronic signature at the bottom of that webpage. And in March, we send it all to our representatives saying, these are all the people in our state that care about survivors and want full funding for the services that they need. Yes, please share widely. That goes till I think the last day of February. And on the website, you can even download this beautiful lilac background if you want to wear it yourself around in presentations and meetings. And that is it. I finished a little early. So is there anyone else that has questions? I thought I would talk right up to the end, but. And if you're taking it all in and think of a question later, our contact information is at the end, at the end slide as well. Like Molly said, we're happy to talk with you about connecting with your local VSP, or talk with VSPs about connecting with their local homeless programs, homeless service providers. We are here as a resource and support for any of y'all. Thank you for having us.
Oh, thank y'all. Well,
I don't
Okay.
see any questions coming through, but thank you so much, Brielle and Molly, for delivering this training today, and for Jen for joining us in part 1 as well. We will make the training available on our YouTube. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to myself. I'll put my email in the chat, as well as Brielle and Molly, who shared their information in the chat as well. But unless there are any questions, I think that'll wrap it up. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank y'all. Enjoy your
Thank
14
you.
minutes of free time. And Molly and Brielle, I'll get you what you need to, and I will upload this as soon as I can to YouTube.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. Have a good afternoon, everybody.
Bye, y'all.
Bye, y'all.